Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Section 2 of Chapter 16, the Home Front. And, in the United States, the truth is we were only involved in World War I for a little more than a year, roughly about 18 months or a little less than that. The United States didn't enter World War I until April of 1917 when President Wilson had gone to Congress and asked Congress for a declaration of war. And eventually, Congress approved that on April the 4th, 1917. And at that point in time, then we really had to mobilize to kind of get ready for the war effort, even though Europe, for the most part, had been in the thick of war for a considerable amount of time. So let's talk a little bit about some of the things that our government is going to do to prepare for this war effort. And your first main idea, the government used progressive ideas to manage the economy and also pay for the war. One of the things that we did is we established what was called the War Industry Board. It controlled the flow of raw materials, order construction for new factories, and occasionally set prices, especially on items that could be easily inflated. And this was established in July of 1917. For the most part, it was a very useful tool. And when we get into the Second World War, we're going to kind of replicate this. Another thing that we created was the Food Administration, which encouraged families to conserve food and grow vegetables in what was called a victory garden. The man who created, or I shouldn't say created, but was in charge of the Food Administration was a businessman known as Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover, you're going to hear a lot more about because he's eventually going to be president of the United States and probably gets credited as being maybe one of the more hated presidents because of the fact that he's tied with the Great Depression. But the truth is, Herbert Hoover was really a great man. He was very concerned about the well-being, not only of our troops and making sure that there was plenty of food available for them, but there was an epidemic famine happening in the country of Belgium, and many people were dying of starvation. And the goal was of the Food Administration, not only to provide food for our soldiers, but also to provide food for the needy in Europe. And by doing this, we're going to try to increase food production here in the United States. Part of the Victory Gardens was part of that. But the other is to reduce civilian consumption. And so they implemented things like wheatless Mondays and meatless Tuesdays and porkless Thursdays and all of that to make sure that there was food available. Number 3. Before we get to that, there was also a fuel administration. We were also concerned about conserving energy, particularly coal and oil. But one of the things that we introduced to conserve energy during the war years, World War I, was something known as daylight savings time, which, by the way, we still have to this day. And it's kind of touted with this idea that it's going to conserve energy. We also shortened the work week, so we were only going to have a 5-day work week. And in some cases, they also encourage people to go without heat in certain times of the year, particularly in the wintertime. And you might hear about heatless Mondays. So anyway, and number 3, to fund the war effort, the government raised income taxes. It borrowed money through the sales of what was known as Liberty or Victory bonds. And these were notes, as you can see kind of in the middle of our page here, where if a citizen bought this, they were guaranteed a certain interest rate, and with the idea that they wouldn't cash it in until a set period of time. So if I bought one of these in 1917, I might not be able to cash it until maybe 1927, maybe 10 years down the line. Not only would I get the face value, the $50, but I would probably get interest on that, which might lead to kind of a spending spree time when this came due. And that's kind of what happens in the 1920s. All right, number 4. To prevent strikes from disrupting the war effort, we established what was known as the War Labor Board. And this War Labor Board was actually headed by former President William Howard Taft and one of his friends, a guy named Frank Walsh. And what they did is they mediated some of the labor disputes that could have led to strikes. They improved wages. They actually adopted the 8-hour workday. And if you remember back to when we were talking about the populist movement, this is something that guys like William Jennings Bryan was advocating in the Omaha platform. And we finally get it here during the war years. They also allowed for unions to collectively bargain. And what happens as a result of this board being established, their number of people joining labor unions dramatically increases between 1917 and 1919. And number 5, new government agencies, such as the Committee on Public Information, had the task of selling the war to the people. They actually had something known as the 5-minute men that would give, or 4-minute men, they would give 4-minute speeches, particularly during, in movie theaters, during maybe opera performances or symphony performances during a break, with the hope of selling the war to the people. And number 6, the Sedition Act of 1918 made any public expression of opposition to the war or criticism of the government or a government official illegal. This was a piece of legislation that kind of rode on the coattails of what was known as the Espionage Act of 1917, which basically made it illegal for any citizen of the United States to aid the enemy or to give false reports or to interfere with the war effort. And the whole idea was to kind of get people to be more loyal and to back the American cause here. On the side note, some other things that were happening during the war years. Women and minorities, for the most part, were entering the workforce. Roughly 1 million women who had never taken on jobs before entered the labor force, kind of bumping the number to about 8 million women total in the labor pool. And a lot of these gals were actually taking jobs that had traditionally been held by men, working in shipyards, working in factories. But the idea was that this labor was all going to be temporary. When the war ended and the men came home, these women would exit the workforce. There was also the great migration of African Americans from the South to the North. Cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, Cleveland had kind of an influx of what used to be former sharecroppers and such coming from the South and moving to the North. Matter of fact, Henry Ford sent recruiters down into the Deep South to send people to Detroit. And roughly 300 to 500,000 African Americans left the South during this period of time. And many of them didn't go back. They stayed in the North. Mexicans also came into the United States. About 100,000 Mexicans came in, some working in the Southwest and in ranching and farming. Others moved into factory labor in cities like Chicago, St. Louis, and even Omaha. All right. In your next main idea, the United States instituted a draft for military service, and African Americans and women took on new roles, as I mentioned before. Believing that the draft was necessary, Congress created a new system of conscription called the Selective Service Act. And what it basically required is if you were a male between the ages of 21 and 30, you were required by law to go and register with the draft board of your local county or community. And what would happen is that individuals would be selected by a lottery, in other words, random selection. Certainly, there were people that did not qualify, and there were exemptions that were given. But in the end, we had roughly 2.8 million people that were going to be drafted into the military. Okay, many American soldiers who served overseas were not conscripts, but many of them did volunteer, and roughly 2 million soldiers answered the nation's call for service. So in the end, that we had very close to about 5 million Americans who were fighting in this war. 50,000 soldiers died in combat. Over 200,000 soldiers were wounded during the war. And another sad note is that about 60,000 soldiers died of disease. And if you remember when we talked about the Civil War, about as many people died of disease as they died in combat. So, I mean, this is a change in a sense, but the big epidemic that happened was the influenza epidemic in 1918. And not only did soldiers die, but we had a lot of civilians that died of that epidemic as well. African Americans had an opportunity to serve in segregated units during World War I. Part of that was because that was kind of the practice of the military. Roughly 42,000 African Americans served in World War I. Women, for the most part, World War I was the first war that they could officially serve in the armed forces. And we saw many women serving in the forms of nursing or secretarial work, but this was a first. Thank you very much.